Elliot grew up being afraid of his own voice. To him, words were a labyrinth. At the beginning of every sentence, there was hope for an exit. But most of the time, he got lost in that labyrinth, while other children spoke as if swallowing words. Every letter got stuck in his mouth, echoing sound as if hitting a wall. It was his first year at school. He was 5 years old and stuttered while saying his name. And from that moment on for everyone, his name was no longer Elliot. It was Stutterer, the first taunt, the first laughter, that tiny wound that started in that tiny moment, over time turned into a thick scab. Teachers, among the hands volunteering to read assignments, when they chose him, there would be a hard thump in his heart. His hands would sweat, his tongue would go numb, and he would lower his head. Then everyone would turn their heads away from him. Even making eye contact was difficult now. For years, Elliot chose not to speak. He had created a kind of invisibility for himself, carrying his silence like a refuge. The words lived in his notebooks. The sentences he wrote were fluent, even beautiful. But everything that came out of his mouth was broken, fragmented and incomplete. Sometimes, before going to sleep at night, he would stand in front of the mirror and talk to himself. His face would blush, his eyes would fill with tears, but he would repeat it every night. The same words with the same pain, as if one day that lock would open. When he went to university, this burden was still with him, but he had learned to carry it differently now. He had developed his written expression so much that the professors praised every text he wrote. People interpreted his silence as seriousness. Yet inside Elliot, there was still a child on that stage, stuck on the day he couldn't say his name. At the end of the final year, a speaker was to be chosen for the school graduation ceremony. An open call was made to the students. Share with us a text that comes from your heart. Elliot thought for a few days. Then one night he opened his notebook and began to write. Lines one by one poured, he told his story, his stutter, the shame from his childhood, his lonely nights in front of the mirror, but also his never giving up, even if he didn't speak. He never stopped speaking from within. Every word he wrote was like a compensation for what he couldn't say for years. This text was like a letter to the child within him. It was telling him your voice may be wounded, but you can still tell your story. He submitted the text, and a few days later an email arrived. You have been selected. You are our graduation speaker. At that moment, everything stopped. Joy and fear started to compete. His heart was beating so fast, it felt like it would burst out of his chest. The school had chosen him, but there was something they didn't know. Elliot couldn't speak, or at least he thought so. The day of the ceremony arrived. When he stepped onto the stage, the paper in his hand was shaking his hands. The hall was full of students, teachers, families, and in the front row, his mother. The moment his eyes met hers, he felt a momentary calm inside. There was a word in those eyes. You can do it. Elliot took the microphone in his hand. He took a deep breath and began. The first sentence didn't finish. A few people turned their heads. A woman furrowed her brows and started to listen. But there was no laughter. Elsa tried again to complete the sentence. Words were once again a knot in her throat. But this time she didn't run away. She didn't run away. She continued. With each stutter, the hall grew even quieter. With each pause, more admiration appeared in people's eyes. Because what they saw there was not perfect oratory but raw, true courage indeed. By the time she reached the middle of the text, her voice was clearer, because at that moment she realized that crowd didn't want her to be perfect. They wanted her to be real. They wanted her to be herself with her wounded voice. When she finished her speech, she lowered the paper. There was a few seconds of silence. Then the entire hall began to applaud standing, literally hundreds of people in tears. At that moment, something changed within Eliotun. Her voice was no longer a source of shame, but had turned into a strength, and that voice was touching the hearts of others. Within months, her speech spread on social media. Millions watched. They called her the woman who spoke with a stutter. She was invited to conferences. She took to the stages. Each time she always did not hide her stutter. She paused deliberately. She stumbled on purpose, because those pauses were no longer a source of shame. They were part of the narrative. Elliot was no longer just a speaker. He was a man who had faced his own fears. With his wounded voice, he was giving courage to thousands of people. And one day a journalist asked him, "So, do you still stutter?" Elliot smiled. "Sometimes, but it no longer stops me, because I realize that people do not remember how perfectly you spoke, but the moment you found the courage to use your voice, they never forget." The second story, Isabel was born on the edge of the desert, where the sun rose from the same place every morning, where the land had been longing for a drop of water for years, in a place where people even slowed down while breathing. It was as if the town's name had been forgotten. It was on maps but never mentioned in conversations. No one moved there. Most of the time, people quietly migrated away from there. But Isabel stayed. When she was little, her mother would tell her stories every night. Most of the stories took place in forests. Children wandering among giant trees, towns waking up to the sounds of birds. Isabel would close her eyes and dive into the green of those fairy tale forests. But the view she encountered when she woke up in the morning was always the same: yellow soil, cracked ground, and dry branches flying in the wind. One morning, when she was just a couple of years old, in the ruins behind the old school building, she found a rusty tin can. Inside were a few seeds, dried and almost moldy. On the seeds was a yellowed label. It read "Great Oak" in her hands. She didn't know what to do while holding them, but a feeling inside her whispered that those seeds still had a chance. She went home to her mother's. Old, no longer used. She filled an old coffee mug with some soil, placed a seed inside, and started watering that mug every morning. For days, nothing happened. A week passed, and there was only wet soil in the mug. 2 weeks, 3 weeks, but she didn't give up, watering it every morning without any sign, saying hello every evening. One morning, she saw a tiny green sprout in the middle of the mug. A sprout was alive. It was breathing, and at that moment, Isabel made a decision. One day, she would create a forest in the middle of that desert. The next year, she planted 3 more seeds, and the following year, 5 more. It was difficult to find seeds. She ordered some from the internet, collected some from the abandoned houses in the town. Many of them never sprouted. Some dried up, some were toppled by storms. But Isabel kept going. She woke up before dawn to water the saplings, set up shades over them, supported their heads when the wind blew. During dry summers, carrying her bucket on her shoulder, she watered each one individually. In her early 20s, there were 15 trees on a hill outside the town. By the time she was 30, this number had exceeded 100. At first, the townspeople mocked her. They said, "Can trees grow here?" They said that there's dust here instead of leaves. But Isabel didn't listen. She neither responded to them nor tried to explain herself, because she spoke with patience, in a silent language with the earth. Over time, people began to change. The elderly who came to rest in the shade of the trees, mothers who brought their children to play, even curious tourists from outside. Slowly, Isabel's trees became the center of the town. One day, the geography department of a university, while working on desertification maps, examined new satellite images. They saw a green vein in the middle of that barren area, an unnaturally straight line. They conducted research. They came to the field and realized with amazement, this line is sown by Isabel Hart's hands one by one. It was a line formed by 312 trees, 312 lives that resisted, blown away by the wind, and took root in the soil instead of being scorched by the sun. National newspapers came to the town to conduct interviews. Environmental awards were offered. Universities wanted her to give talks. But Isabel still wakes up every morning before sunrise, crouching at the base of the tree to check the soil. In the only interview she gave to the media, she said just one sentence: "Some miracles go unnoticed simply because they move very slowly, but they do not stop." Years passed. The forest grew. People started moving to the town. When Isabel reached her 60s, that area had become a protected, natural habitat. Schools organized student trips. Children read books in the shade of the oaks. One day, a little girl sitting next to her turned to her. "Did you plant all these trees?" Isabel smiled. She slowly nodded her head. "No, I just started it. The earth grew them. I just waited patiently." The girl looked at her silently, then lifted her eyes up. In the light filtering through the wide branches of the oak tree, dust particles were dancing. Time is the earth's best friend. If you know how to wait, one day it will reward you with its shade. The third story, when the war started, was something no one exactly remembered anymore. The town on the northern border had been silent for weeks. There was no electricity. Water was limited. News spread only in whispers. The sky was grey, not from clouds but from smoke, and the earth was turning a little more brown each day. 8-year-old Malik had indeed grown up in this silence. He had no toys, but he had cars made from an old tin can found in the trash, and puppets made from pieces of fabric. He was alone. His father had gone to the front years ago. His mother worked at the aid center during the day, and in the evenings she would fall into a tired silence. One day, as they entered the third winter of the war, Malike noticed an object being blown by the wind in the street. It was colorful and made of fabric. It was a kite. Its string had broken. It was torn in places but still held its colors. Malik's eyes lit up. He approached slowly. He felt as if he had found something magical and picked up the kite. He tied its string to an old broomstick handle. And on one of those gray days, behind the collapsed roof of the school building, he released it into the sky. At that moment, for the first time in weeks, a color appeared in the sky. As the kite rose, an idea came to Malik's mind. He wrote a short letter on a small piece of paper with childlike handwriting. "I am Malik. I want to believe that this war will end. If you are reading this letter, please write me something about peace." He tied the letter under the kite, then released it even higher with the wind, and at one point he let go of the string. The kite glided in the sky. It drifted away and disappeared from sight. Malik waited in front of the window until morning. He wanted to believe that something would happen, but he didn't know what would come. 3 days later, in another country, just a few kilometers from the border, a 3-year-old girl named Eleanor, while playing in the backyard of their house, noticed something falling from the sky. It was a kite with a note attached to it. It was written in English, in a disorganized childish handwriting. Eleanor read the letter. It was clear it was written by a small child. Her heart ached. She showed it to her mother. Her mother, with tears in her eyes, folded the letter and kept it. But Eleanor did something else. She wrote a new letter. "Dear Malik, I received your letter. I don't know you, but we can imagine peace together. I am telling you about the sky. Right now it's blue. I hope the sky is blue for you too." She also attached this letter to a kite and let it go into the sky. After that day, on both sides of the border, dozens of children started attaching letters to the kites they made themselves. Some reached someone, some never came down. But that small exchange, that little hope spread wave by wave. Local newspapers talked about these strange kite letters. Stories began to be shared on social media. People started sharing the letters. He started sharing the letters he wrote for peace. Even though countries continued to be enemies, an invisible bond was being formed between the people. And finally, one morning, Malik saw a new poster on the walls of his town. An international aid organization was going to organize a kite peace festival in the town, open to everyone unarmed. A quiet day, kites in the sky, letters in the wind. Malik made the same kite again that day. Its colors were now more faded, but it was still flying. And he wrote the sentence, "I am Malik. I grew up in this war, but I learned to be a child in peace. Thank you, unknown girl." The kite was still flying, like a trace in the sky, like a word suspended between two children. The fourth story is Jonathan, once a name that resonated in the world of architecture. To the cold lines of modernism, was known for adding human touches. When he reached the age of 30, magazines started calling him the visionary man designing the future. His projects were winning awards. His talks were being cited in universities. And most importantly, he believed it too. Not because he truly believed, but because he started to believe thanks to the applause. The little child inside him had once been homeless, felt the hardness of concrete on his back. The child was now lost, replaced by expensive watches, fast cars and cold meeting rooms. And then came the Aurora Towers project. In the city center, a twin tower complex reaching towards the sky. Its design was revolutionary. Press conferences, presentations with million-dollar investors. Jonathan was both the architect and the face of the project. His name was everywhere. 7 months after the construction began, a collapse occurred in the North Tower. Although no one died, the damage was extensive. The media launched an attack. Investigations were initiated, and they soon indeed learned the truth. A critical mistake had been made. The main load-bearing beams were installed with incorrect material calculations, and the person who personally approved those calculations was John. A single signature, but that signature destroyed his career, his reputation and his self-confidence. A month later, Jonathan moved to a rural town with a fake identity, rented a simple house. He had no internet, his phone was off, he erased himself from the world. Every morning he went for a walk. He made drawings in an old notebook. But this time not skyscrapers. Single-story modest houses, verandas where one could sit in the garden, corridors where human voices could echo. He showed these drawings to no one, because the little child inside him had started to speak again, this time in a whisper. Don't just do what's beautiful, do what's necessary. Months passed. People in the town made up rumors about him. Someone who escaped from the city, an ex-criminal or maybe a writer. But Jonathan gave no explanation to anyone. Until that night, the town's only school, unused for years, was in an abandoned building. That night lightning struck. A fire broke out. No one was inside. But the building was completely reduced to ashes. The next morning, the townspeople gathered at the ruins. The mayor murmured, sadly, "We didn't have a restoration budget anyway. Now nothing can be done." Jonathan stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, and for the first time he said something. "I am an architect." It was like a confession, the first time he put into words the guilt he had carried for years. At first, no one trusted him, but he showed his drawings, a single-story school instead of 3 stories, solar-powered natural, classrooms with natural light, a place where every child would feel at home as they step in. Enthusiastic volunteers gathered, carpenters, old wall masons, retired teachers, everyone did something. John worked day and night. With the sound of hammers, his guilt also cracked. It shattered. It literally took a year. When the new school opened, it was Jonathan's first project he designed, without applause and without advertisement, but for the first time, it was real. On the opening day, a small child approached him. He asked why trees could be seen from every classroom window. Because being able to look at a tree while growing up makes you feel like you're growing too. Years passed. That school became the most applied to school in the region. Other architects studied Jonathan's project. Nothing was extraordinary, but everything was as it should be. Jonathan never built a skyscraper again. He never took on any luxury projects. But across the country, he consulted on more than 20 school projects, only in regions that needed it, only in plans that prioritized children first. And this time, the foundation was laid not just with steel, but with regret, with humility and hope. What elevates a person the most is not the massive structures they build, but what they decide to rebuild when it collapses.